Hey, I'm Jason with Major League Hacking, and tonight I'm going to talk about Ruby on Rails. So, what is this Rails thing that everyone's been talking about? Rails is a web framework based on the Ruby programming language. This is a really important distinction, as it turns out, because when someone writes a web application in Ruby on Rails, they might say that they're writing Rails, and that's just not the case. They're actually writing their code in the programming language Ruby, which has a distinct flavor that is provided by the Rails framework. That distinctive flavor is provided through the use of domain-specific languages, or DSLs. DSLs are a programming paradigm in Ruby that let developers take functionality and hide it behind language semantics that make sense to our natural language comprehensions. So think about appropriately named functions in a C++ program or in a Java program taken to an absolute extreme. A DSL might look something like this. So just reading this, having no context on Ruby or Rails or anything, we can assume that it's talking about some object. So some object has multiple states that are initially set to active. There are two of these states, the initial active state, and these objects can also be alumni. So let's say that these are students of a university. These students, when they graduate, transition from an active status to an alumni status. And all of this is written in plain English in Ruby and in Rails applications, and it's fairly legible even if you have absolutely no context. Because this language is based entirely on domain-specific languages and the natural extension of domain-specific languages, which is to provide developers with an easier way to get things done and express how they want things to interact, it's pretty fair to say that Rails is an opinionated framework. It's written with one way, the presumed, quote, right way, of getting things done in mind. So the people who wrote Rails think this is how it's done, this is how it should be, and this is how we're going to make it easy to build future applications. Working against that prescribed way tends to take a lot more effort than it's really worth, and you find yourself bashing your head against a wall thinking, why am I doing this? However, when you work the way that Rails wants you to, you get a lot of things for free. You get a natural model view controller separation of concerns. So if you're not familiar, model view controller is a programming paradigm where different components are responsible for different interactions in the web stack. So when you make a request to, say, Facebook, you're hitting an endpoint that says, hey, Jason has signed into Facebook. That's the controller. The controller is going to ask the database what things are in Jason's newsfeed. So in this paradigm, the controller says, get all models that represent newsfeed items relevant to Jason. Once those are retrieved, the controller will then say, all right, now I need to present those to Jason. So it passes them to a view, which is entirely responsible for the presentation of the model and whatever data the controller adds to that model. All of these components interact independently of each other. So you can make a change to the model without necessarily needing to make a change to the view. And you can add additional data to the view as long as you don't need to make a change to the database representation without actually changing the model or controller. In addition, the Rails framework pioneered the idea of dirt-simple, domain-specific language-defined routing, which we'll see in a few minutes as I jump into a live coding example. Before Rails, the idea that the application server itself defined routes that the user and/or client could access was not common. Applications were entirely reliant on the URLs that were input in a browser or the actions of a web form, which puts too much reliance on external factors to the application and doesn't give developers the control over what's permissible and allowable in their application that they really should have. So what? What are the applications of this? Why should you care about this when you're talking about building your next project or at your next hackathon and thinking about how you can build Uber for dog walkers or whatever your next great idea is easily and quickly? One of the huge benefits of the way that Rails operates is that it's extremely powerful for building APIs. One of the best case in points of this that I can find is that Stripe, which is a huge payment processor if you're not familiar, that is powering Apple Pay and numerous other technologies, uses Rails to power their APIs. And they've found it extremely flexible while allowing them to maintain the privacy and control over the data necessary to run their entire operation. But arguably, even more importantly, Rails is extremely powerful when you're building applications that perform 4 basic tenets of web applications: creating records, reading records, updating them, and deleting them. When you think about it, these are operations that databases use extremely frequently, and they form a core basis of what the internet is and what most web pages are. So with that in mind, we'll take an example of an application like this, a create, read, update, delete, and we're going to build it now in Rails and see just how easy it is. So we're going to build a blog. So you might think that it would be easier to use WordPress to build a blog, but it's really quite simple. We can start with Rails new my blog. And Rails will generate this project directory for you that's a bare bones application. It takes a couple seconds as it gathers all its dependencies. And then you're given this nice, neatly formatted project directory. You have all of the code that correlates to what your application does in its regular operation in an app directory, which contains the model view controller separation. You have a directory for models, a directory for views, a directory for controllers, and a couple other directories that you might find useful further down the road as you build more Rails applications. We have a directory that describes our database. We have a directory that describes configuration of the application in various environments, so when it's on a server as opposed to when you're using it locally. And we have various other directories that allow us to very quickly and easily test our applications. So how do we go from this bare bones bunch of folders to building a full-fledged blog? We start by thinking about what does a blog consist of, primarily. For the sake of this example, let's say that a blog is comprised only of posts. You have a bunch of posts with a bunch of content in each post. So building this is actually quite straightforward. We can say Rails generate scaffold, which creates a full create, read, update, delete environment for what we're going to describe, which is a post that has a name that's a string value and some body, which is arbitrary text. So we're going to create that. And Rails will create a bunch of files for us. These files include the model that we discussed, which interacts with the database, a controller, which describes how the browser requests and processes data back to the database, and a set of views which describe the presentation of that data. So from here, we can update the database with that new object. And then we can do the real work in this application. So before I talked about routing, where you could specify exactly what is permissible in your application. So we're going to edit the routes file, and we're going to say that when you access the root domain, so when you access, let's call this abc.com, when you go to abc.com, the first thing you want to see is a list of all the posts in your database. So let's say that the root of this application is the index page of posts, where index is just a list of everything that's relevant to the visitor. So if we go over to our post controller, we can look at exactly what the index method does, and it's in fairly plain English. It reads like exactly what it says. When we call the index method, we pull all the posts out of the database and put them in this variable. Once we have that variable, we create a really simple view that says, we have the name and body of these posts. For every one, just put that into a table and give us some options for things to do with it. We can go to a specific page designed for it. So think of a newspaper article as opposed to the front page of the New York Times. This would be a link to the article itself. As an administrator, we can edit or delete that record as you'd expect to be able to do on a blog. and you can create a new one. So with all that in mind, we can run our application locally, which takes a second to start up. Maybe more than a second. Maybe even more than a second. So these applications, when you first start them, can be a little slow, and this is unusually slow, but it happens. And there it goes. And all of a sudden, we have that list of posts. So we can see this in action by creating a new post. Let's say my first blog post, and our canonical programming example of Hello World. We create it. All of a sudden, we're on the show page for that post. And we can go back to our index, see all of them. We can go view it, we can edit it, add some text, and you can see that it's persisted right into the database. There's no friction necessary, and we can delete it if we want to, and that's a really simple Rails application. From here, making this look prettier is just a matter of editing HTML in our views directory, which is right here. We can add CSS to this, we can pretty it up. That's not the point of this talk, I'm not going to go into that, but we can make this look really pretty that was probably about 3 minutes of effort. So yeah, that's all I've got. This code is online at github.com/mlh/buildablog for your reference. I'm Jason Berlinsky. I'm Jason at mlh.io, and I'm on Twitter at Jason Berlinsky. Feel free to ask me any questions about this. I'm more than happy to help, and thanks for listening.
All right, question from the audience. When should you use Rails versus Sinatra and vice versa?
So Rails is really powerful when you're doing, like I mentioned, create, read, update, delete applications. It removes a lot of the boilerplate code that you need to write in order to make those happen. Whereas Sinatra is very specifically designated as a micro framework, so it's intended to be a very thin layer on top of some other service. So if all you really need is to take data from your database and shovel out a list of names of posts as a JSON endpoint, Sinatra is probably more than enough for that when combined with certain parts of Rails, like Active Record, which is a smaller component within Rails that handles database interactions. In reality, I haven't found many uses where Sinatra is particularly useful for a large application. It's really powerful for small applications that don't need to do much business logic.
What are the common stumbling points you see with Rails and people who are just getting started, and things for people to watch out for?
So one of the biggest things that I've seen, and this actually affected me a lot when I first started with Rails 4 or 5 years ago, is that testing is a critical component of the Rails ecosystem. There are very few software engineers who write code in Ruby and in Rails who will say otherwise. But a lot of them get tripped up by the fact that the people they're working with need things done fast. And while Rails is really great at getting things done fast, it only moves as fast and as flexibly as the developer and the environment the developers are in let them. So if you find yourself in an environment where you don't have time to write tests, that's going to come back and bite you, much like it would in any other programming language or any other framework or anywhere really, even though you might think you have additional flexibility because of the initial setup time. So even though I didn't talk about it much here, testing is a really important component of Rails applications because it gives you protections against things breaking in the future and against things that, if you're building something like Stripe, could cost your company millions of real dollars.
Any closing thoughts before we sign off here?
Rails is awesome. Reach out. I love to preach the gospel of Rails.